Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso, and I'll be talking about another discourse of the Buddha. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha, and then I'll read through the sutta and give some explanations. And you can type in questions at any time, and I'll respond to questions at the end. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So this is a discourse from the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 3, sutta number 11. The Sattajaṭilasutta, which I'll be reading here from Bhante Suddhāso's translation, though I'll likely make a few adjustments to the translation as I go along. So Sattajaṭila, the word satta means seven, and jatila refers to tangled hair or matted hair ascetics. So during the time of the Buddha, as today in India to this day, but in the time of the Buddha, there were many different traditions of ascetics and spiritual contemplatives and spiritual wanderers and practitioners of all sorts. So all different kinds of monks, effectively, following often wildly different rules, wildly different practices. Different kinds of observances that would be part of their spiritual path. And one which was quite common and is still common even to this day among spiritual ascetics in India was the practice of not taking care of your hair at all. So this is beyond dreadlocks. So dreadlocks, as anyone who has had dreadlocks or knows people who've had dreadlocks might know, it actually does take some amount of effort and work to make it look good, look nice, and be relatively presentable. The matted hair ascetics would do literally nothing at all. They would just let their hair turn into this giant tangled mess. They also wouldn't wash it. They wouldn't comb it or brush it or literally do anything at all with it. So this was one very common ascetic practice, and it's, as I mentioned, it's still done to this day in India by many groups. And it's one of the things that Buddhist monks are forbidden to do. So Buddhist monks have the opposite approach to our hair. The Buddha instructed us to regularly shave our heads. He was relatively lenient. We actually only need to shave our heads once every 2 months, which is quite permissive. Normally, Buddhist monks shave our heads significantly more often than that. But it was on the opposite side. It was still a practice of doing something outside of the social norm with one's hair. So in the time of the Buddha, to have a shaved head was very uncommon. In fact, it was often used as a punishment for criminals. So if somebody committed a serious crime, then their head would be shaved as a punishment. And similarly, to have tangled, matted, unkempt hair was also socially unacceptable. So either to shave one's head or to let one's hair be a disastrous mess, either one was a way of clearly stating that one was outside of the social order, that one was doing something outside of the bounds of ordinary society. So that's a bit of background on the sutta. So the sutta, again, it's called Seven Matted Hair Ascetics. And the sutta begins, it says, at one time the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in the stilt longhouse of Mrigara's mother in the eastern monastery. Then in the late afternoon, the Buddha came out of retreat and sat outside the gate. Then King Pasenadi of Kosala went up to the Buddha, bowed, and sat down to one side. So King Pasenadi was the king of Kosala, which was one of the many small kingdoms in northern India at the time. And King Pasenadi was also a devout follower of the Buddha. So we have many suttas recorded of conversations between King Pasenadi and the Buddha. So the sutta continues. It says, now at that time, 7 matted hair ascetics, which, as I just mentioned, were people who would, as part of their spiritual practice, they would let their hair grow into a tangled, unkempt, disastrous mess. So it says, now at that time, 7 matted hair ascetics, 7 Jain ascetics. So Jain ascetics still exist to this day. So Jainism was started in ancient India at the same time and place as the Buddha, and has survived to the modern day, though there's not that many. I think there's only a few million Jains in the world, so much fewer than Buddhists, but it still persists to this day. And Jains had their own sets of rules. So there were some Jain orders that would wear just one white robe all the time. So they'd have a single white robe that would be their monastic garment. There were also Jains who would practice nakedness as a spiritual observance, either all of the time or part of the time. And their main practices were about extreme non-harming, far beyond what Buddhists do, because in Jainism there was the belief that even accidentally causing harm to a sentient being was bad karma, as opposed to in the Buddhist view, where causing harm is only karma if one does so intentionally. Again, it says 7 Jain ascetics, then 7 naked ascetics. So it's interesting that it's listed as a separate category, because actually the practice of going about naked was something which was practiced by many of the different spiritual traditions at the time of the Buddha. And again, to this day in India, there are still some monastic or ascetic groups that follow the practice of going around naked. And again, this is one of the things that's forbidden to Buddhist monks. So we're not allowed to go about naked. Next, it says 7 one-cloth ascetics. So these were ones who they would have a single robe, a single piece of cloth that was the only thing they would wear. So they wouldn't own multiple garments. They would just have one cloth, which usually would just be one big rectangle that they would wrap around their body. Again, not actually that different from the robe that we wear, except in the Buddhist tradition, we have 3 robes. So normally one that's a bit smaller that we wear as a skirt, one that's a bit bigger that we wear to cover the torso, and also usually it hangs down past one's knees. And then a third large one that's usually double layer or more, and serves as an extra warm robe when it's cold. So this, again, if you're a lay person who's used to having multiple closets full of hundreds of different outfits to pick from, then the Buddhist monks having only 3 robes, that might seem pretty austere. But in the standards of monastic society in India, 3 robes was actually a little bit on the luxurious side, because there were, again, these orders who would have only 1 robe, or even would go around completely naked. But the Buddha allowed 3 robes out of his compassion. And the reason for this was so that monastic life would be not too difficult, not too comfortable either, but also not overwhelmingly difficult. So 7 one-cloth ascetics, as mentioned, and it says 7 wanderers, and the term that's used here is paribhajika. And that's kind of a catch-all term. So paribhajika, again, literally means one who wanders around. So literally means wanderer. And there's some places in the suttas where this word is used in just the generic sense of meaning someone who wanders. But normally it has the meaning of a spiritual wanderer. Someone whose spiritual practice involves wandering from place to place, not having a fixed home or a fixed abode or a fixed residence, but instead being constantly wandering from place to place. And this was actually a very common practice for Buddhist monks during the time of the Buddha. And even to this day, there's many Buddhist monks who keep up the tradition. But the Buddha himself made a further stipulation, which was that we could not wander 100% of the time. We could do the ascetic practice of wandering, and in fact, the Buddha praised it, spoke about its merits, its values, its benefits to one's spiritual practice. But we also needed to spend at least 3 months of the year staying in one place. So we could wander, but not all the time, maximum 9 months of the year. Because the Buddha spoke about, again, the dangers of wandering too much, but also the dangers of staying in one place for too long. And the Buddha encouraged us to balance these two aspects of the Buddhist monastic life. So again, the 7 wanderers, and so it says, so all these categories of different ascetics and spiritual contemplatives, different kinds of non-Buddhist monks at the time, passed by not far from the Buddha. It says their armpits and bodies were hairy and their nails were long, and they carried their stuff with shoulder poles. So again, this is just indicating that they were, again, unkempt, unbathed, they weren't manicured. So these were clearly people who were living a dirty, unkempt, ascetic life. And the sutta continues, it says, then King Pasenadi got up from his seat, arranged his robe over one shoulder, knelt with his right knee on the ground, raised his joined palms towards those various ascetics, and pronounced his name 3 times. Bhantes, I am Pasenadi, king of Kosala. I am Pasenadi, king of Kosala. So this was a way of showing respect in that time. So he put his hands in Anjali, he got down on one knee and announced his name. So that was a way of paying homage, of venerating those people. So this is also one of the interesting things that we find in the suttas, which is that although King Pasenadi was a devoted Buddhist, he still showed respect and reverence towards dedicated spiritual contemplatives of other traditions. And in fact, the Buddha encouraged this. There's many places in the suttas where the Buddha said not to only respect Buddhist monks, not to only make offerings to Buddhist monks, not to only support Buddhist monks, but also to respect and appreciate and support spiritual contemplatives of any tradition. So the Buddha was not stingy in terms of support and respect for the Buddha Sangha, but rather he was encouraging people to appreciate anyone who makes the effort of committing themselves to a spiritual life, even if one thinks that that spiritual life is based upon incorrect doctrines or incorrect practices. Still, you respect the fact that somebody has a spiritual motive, a spiritual drive, a spiritual inclination, that they're doing their best to try to live a holy life. Even if you think their holy life is not the best one, or it's a bit misguided, one should still have that respect and reverence and appreciation for the kind of spiritual drive that leads someone to commit their life to a contemplative practice, to following a contemplative path. One of the interesting examples of this, I'm blanking on his name, but there's the case of a wealthy, influential layman who was previously a supporter of the Jains. And after a conversation with the Buddha, he decided to become Buddhist instead. And he told the Buddha, like, oh, I have this custom of offering food and supplies to the Jain monks. And the Buddha said, keep doing it. Don't stop doing that. Keep doing that. It's okay if you want to also start supporting the Buddhist monks now, but don't stop supporting the Jain monks just because you've decided you're into Buddhism. So again, this is one thing that I find quite interesting about the Buddha, is that he did not condemn supporting monks of other religions. In fact, he encouraged it. He praised it. Anyway, so King Pasenadi paid respects to these wanderers and monks and practitioners of other spiritual systems, and doing this in front of the Buddha. So again, you'll notice the Buddha doesn't say anything against this, because as I said, the Buddha actually approved of respecting and supporting monks of other traditions as well. So it says, then soon after those ascetics had left, King Pasenadi went up to the Buddha, bowed, sat down to one side, and said to him, Bhante, are they among those in the world who are arhants or who are on the path to arhants? So I find this a cute thing. So one of the things about the Buddha is that, of course, the Buddha could read minds. He could read people's minds. And the Buddha could tell, by looking at someone's mind, he could tell who was enlightened and who was not. He could tell who was practicing in a way that would lead towards enlightenment and who was not. So King Pasenadi is kind of like, Bhante, could you let me know? Could you have a peek in their minds and see how their practice is going? Which is really missing the point, by the way, because there's elsewhere in the suttas where it's also clearly stated that when supporting the sangha, one should support the sangha impartially. So instead of thinking like, oh, Ajahn Wade, he's clearly doing really well in his practice, probably getting close to enlightenment by now, I should give all my offerings to Ajahn Wade. But not to Bhante Suddhāso. He's awful. His practice sucks. He's clearly nowhere near awakening, nothing for him. So, I mean, I wouldn't blame somebody if they made that kind of choice, but the Buddha said that's not the right way. The right way is to support all sangha members equally and impartially, not making distinctions, not saying like, oh, this one I like more, or that one I respect more, or that one I think has a better practice, so I'm going to give them extra stuff or better stuff. But rather, one should support all of them equally without making these sorts of distinctions. Nonetheless, people would still try to find out which monk was maybe a bit farther along, so that then they could try to make more merit by giving them extra support. And that still goes on to this day in Buddhist cultures. If a rumor starts going around that such and such monk has some stage of awakening, then suddenly they'll get a lot more material support, which again indicates that a lot of people don't quite understand the Buddha's message around supporting the sangha. Which is that when we support the sangha, we're supporting the sangha as a whole, not any one individual member, but we're supporting the sangha as a whole. And in fact, there's an interesting sutta where the Buddha states that there's more merit to supporting the sangha as a whole than there is to supporting even a fully enlightened monk. So it's better to give to 2 unenlightened monks than it is to give to 1 enlightened monk. And again, this is because it's showing that one is respecting the sangha as a whole. One is respecting what the sangha itself is, which is a vehicle for everyone to attain awakening. It's something which uplifts and supports everyone's practice. So it's not actually about individual people, but rather it's about the spiritual path itself, which can carry countless beings to liberation. So King Pasenadi asked the Buddha to have a peek and see if any of these are arhants or if they're getting close. And the Buddha replies, he says, "Great king, as a layman enjoying sensuality, living at home with your children, using sandalwood imported from Kasi, wearing garlands, fragrance, and makeup, accepting gold and currency, it's hard for you to know who is an arhat or on the path to becoming an arhat." So I also find this cute. The Buddha's like, okay, let's be realistic. You're a layperson. You're immersed in sensuality, far from renunciation. It's really difficult for someone who's living an ordinary worldly life. It's really difficult for them to evaluate the spiritual practice of other people. So the truth is, it's really difficult even for other monks. even for someone with a very advanced spiritual practice, it can still be quite difficult to evaluate how good somebody else's practice is going. And the Buddha is saying, like, even more so, like if you're just living an ordinary, mundane, worldly life, immersed in sensuality, immersed in superficial values, then of course you're going to have a really hard time evaluating who's the best monk, who's the most advanced in their practice, who's doing better than another one. It's really hard to make these distinctions. And again, as mentioned elsewhere in the suttas, it's also completely irrelevant, because we should be supporting all of them equally and impartially. But then the Buddha carries on. He says, you can get to know a person's morality by living with them, but only after a long time, not a short time. Only when attentive, not when inattentive, and only by the wise, not the foolish. You can get to know a person's purity by dealing with them. A bit of an odd translation. So sangvohara means interacting, communicating, conversation. Dealing with them is a little bit off because it sounds like commerce. But it has more the sense of interacting or conversing with someone. And again, he says, but only after a long time, not a short time, only when paying attention, not when not paying attention, and only by the wise, not by the foolish. Next, he says, you can get to know a person's resilience in times of trouble or when there is disaster. But he carries on, he says, but only after a long time, not a short time, only when paying attention, not when not paying attention, and only by the wise, not by the foolish. And he says, you can get to know a person's wisdom by discussion, by conversation, but only after a long time, not a short time, only when paying attention, not when not paying attention, and only by the wise, not by the foolish. So this also is interesting here. So here the Buddha is saying, the Buddha actually, after telling King Pasenadi not to bother evaluating these monks, because the Buddha is like, let's be realistic. Your own practice isn't that great. How do you think you're going to evaluate anybody else's? But then the Buddha actually gives this way of evaluating somebody else. And he says, first off, if you want to evaluate the strength of someone's morality, live with them for a long time. So this doesn't mean you just show up and you watch somebody for 5 minutes and you think you already know everything about them. Actually, you might even live with somebody for years and still not really know them that well. There might still be aspects of them that you don't really understand. But generally speaking, if, again, say if you stay in a monastery for several years, then you will start to see if somebody's morality is really good, then you'll notice. You'll notice that their morality is really strong. But if their morality is cracked, if it's weak, if there's gaps, well, I mean, somebody can put up a good show for a few days or a few weeks or a few months even. But if you're staying for several months, several years, then eventually, if there are cracks and flaws in their morality, then you will notice. You'll start to see. But of course, this depends upon paying attention. And it depends upon having sufficient wisdom to know what's moral and what's immoral, what's right behavior and what's wrong behavior. Second, he says, one knows one's purity by dealing with them. So through interactions and exchanges with someone, then you start to see, like, how is this person relating with others? Are they relating to other people as a source of profit, a source of gain? Are they just relating to other people as someone they can take advantage of? Are they relating to other people with an attitude of selfishness or with an attitude of compassion? So again, watching how someone interacts with others. And through interacting with them yourself, you can start to figure out, how pure is this person? Is their mind overcome with defilements? Are they full of arrogance? Are they full of greed? Are they full of hostility? Or are they very pure-hearted? Is their heart full of kindness and gentleness? Are they patient? Are they generous? Are they thoughtful? Are they considerate? This is something you can figure out through interacting with someone. But again, over a long period of time, and you need to pay attention, and you need to have the wisdom to know right from wrong. Similarly, he says you get to know a person's resilience when there is calamity, when there are disasters, when there's trouble. So again, when everything's going smoothly, then yeah, your equanimity is great. But when there's problems, how does somebody react? Do they laugh and shrug it off, or do they get angry and upset? When things don't go the way they want, what happens? Do they just shrug their shoulders and move on, or do they make a big deal out of it? So watching, again, over a long period of time, observing how somebody handles challenging or difficult situations. And you can start to figure out the level of their inner stability, how good their equanimity is. And finally, he says you get to know a person's wisdom by discussion, through conversation, through talking with them. And again, over a long period of time, through paying attention, and this is dependent upon one's own wisdom. So in a Buddhist context, this means engaging in a lot of Dhamma discussions with people, engaging in a lot of conversations around different aspects of Dhamma and how these apply to our life, how to apply the Dhamma in the various daily situations that we encounter. Then you can start to evaluate how much wisdom somebody actually has. How far have they progressed in the cultivation of wisdom as described in the Buddhist path? So again, there are ways to evaluate how advanced a particular person is in their practice, but it's not something that you can do quickly or easily. And it depends, to some degree, it depends upon the strength of one's own practice. If one's own mindfulness and wisdom are very well developed, then it's much easier to figure out how well somebody else's practice is going. But again, the Buddha is quite clear. You can't necessarily figure things out in an instant. It's not like you can just see somebody walking by and be like, oh yes, there goes that naked ascetic. Their hair is looking especially unkempt and filthy today. They're definitely a moral and wise person. Like, you can't make these kinds of snap judgments. You need to really carefully observe people over a long period of time to figure things out. So that's also the point the Buddha is making here is okay, so King Pasenadi bows to this random group of ascetics walking by. It's like, well, that's fine. That's good, actually, because it's respecting that commitment to a spiritual life, commitment to a holy life. But just because somebody looks like a good monk from the outside for a couple minutes doesn't actually really tell you anything. A lot of people can put on a show for a couple of minutes, but it doesn't indicate purity of heart or development of wisdom. So this was the Buddha's reply, and then King Pasenadi says, it's incredible, Bhante, it's amazing, Bhante, how well said this was by the Buddha. And King Pasenadi repeats what the Buddha said. And this is something we see in a number of places in the suttas, by the way, where the Buddha would give a teaching and then a person would repeat it back. And this was a way of memorizing something, of committing a statement to memory. So then King Pasenadi says, Bhante, these are my spies, my undercover agents returning after spying in the countryside. First they go undercover, then I have them report to me. And now, when they have washed off the dust and dirt, and are nicely bathed and anointed, with hair and beard dressed in white, they will amuse themselves, supplied and provided with the 5 kinds of sensual stimulation. So this is the plot twist, which is that those were actually all fake monks, and King Pasenadi knew they were fake monks. So there's also the subtle implication here that he was also testing the Buddha a little bit. And unfortunately, this has actually been something which has occurred repeatedly throughout recorded history, which is of people pretending to be monastics or pretending to be ascetics as a way of spying on other countries or engaging in different kinds of underhanded activities. Which again is the Buddhist point about the necessity of watching someone over a long period of time in order to really evaluate their character. It's not something that you can evaluate quickly. It's something which takes a long period of time and careful attention. So, and the sutta concludes with a verse. So it says, understanding this matter on that occasion, the Buddha recited these verses. It is not easy to know a man by his appearance. You should not trust them at first sight. For undisciplined people live in this world, disguised as the disciplined. Like a fake earring made of clay, like a copper penny covered with gold, they live hidden in the world, corrupt inside, but impressive outside. So again, a short poem emphasizing the point, which is once again, as they say in English, you can't judge a book by its cover. In other words, just because somebody looks very impressive from the outside doesn't necessarily mean that their heart is pure. You can only actually figure out their purity over an extended period of interaction and observation. So that's the end of the sutta. We can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So hello to the people joining in online. Hello to Sud, Wasabi-chan, Sean, Maria, Mary, Manal, Kumu, Jody, Bhumika, Janaki, Jayanta, Amaranta, Joe, Mita, and anybody else who's watching. And I see a few questions here. So here's one. So Joe says, regarding showing respects to all the sangha members, I've seen something that seems like a real paradox. How does the monastic community deal with situations where a monastic engages in unethical conduct? For example, harming others. Is staying silent ever the right thing to do? It seems like if someone speaks up, it might be labeled as wrong action, something improper to discuss. But if everyone stays quiet, the harm will continue and no one to step in if the person at fault doesn't reflect on their own behavior. Meanwhile, that same person can keep up a facade of hypocrisy and keep doing the same things to others. Well, I'll just, and then Joe goes on to another slightly different question. So I'll just start with what's been brought up here. So one thing that's very important to understand is that Buddhism does not have a central authority. The Catholic religion has the Vatican, a central authority which has effective, complete, and ultimate authority over every single clergy person in Catholicism. So every single priest, every single monk, every single nun within the entire Catholic system worldwide is all under the absolute authority of the Vatican. So that means that if there is a problem with the behavior of a particular clergy person somewhere in the Catholic system, then it can get reported to the higher ups, and it might, or might not, but it might get dealt with by the higher authorities within the Vatican system, within the Catholic Church. Buddhism has nothing like that because the Buddha did not create anything like that. Actually, the system that we have from the time of the Buddha is that every monastery is independent and self-governed. And every monk is independent and self-governed. In fact, a monastery is more like a temporary convention of wanderers, wandering ascetics. Keeping in mind that Buddhist monks from the very beginning were wanderers, wandering ascetics. And every now and then they would come together in a group and live together for a little while and then disperse again. So this idea these days of monasteries as being a group of people who live together constantly for decades on end, this actually wasn't very common in the time of the Buddha. It's become quite common these days, but it was not common in the time of the Buddha. It was more like people coming and going. So the community in any particular area was constantly changing. Monks coming and going all the time. Monasteries would kind of coalesce and then disperse. So it was much more fluid. And if a monk in a particular community was causing a lot of problems, then the other members of the community could come together and try to get that monk to resolve their issues, to change their ways. And if that monk refused, then they could be ejected from that community. But they were still a Buddhist monk, and they could just wander off somewhere else. They just might not be welcome in that particular group of monks anymore. But they're still a Buddhist monk and can go and do whatever they want somewhere else. Of course, we have a handful of rules that we absolutely cannot break wherever we are. Rules that if we break them, we immediately stop being monks. But as far as being accepted or rejected from any particular monastic community, that's actually the decision of that specific independent community. So this does mean that when there's a case of a monk engaging in unethical conduct, it cannot be handled in a heavy-handed, wide spectrum way. It's handled on a community by community basis. So if you have a monastery, and at that monastery a monk is behaving inappropriately, and the other monks try to get that monk to change his ways and he won't, then at some point that monk is just evicted from the monastery and is no longer welcome there. But they might go to somewhere else. But if they continue to misbehave in multiple places, then their list of places they can stay starts to become very short. And that does happen sometimes. You get a monk who's really not behaving properly, then they start running out of places where they can stay, because nobody wants a monk like that in their monastery. And these days with the internet, you can usually figure out, even before a monk shows up, you can start to get some sense of what they're about. But again, the Buddha says not to judge people too quickly, as we see in this sutta. I've met some monks who had a bit of a dodgy reputation, but when I actually met them and spent time with them, they turned out to be totally fine. The reputation was not correct. So we also need to be a little bit careful about judging too quickly. As for speaking up, if you do actually see what seems to be genuinely problematic behavior, then you should speak up. Because that's one of the ways of helping to get people to improve their conduct and also to prevent harm from occurring. I could say more on the matter, but hopefully that's sufficiently clear for now. And then Joe says, in some countries, does being a monastic grant someone a kind of unconditional and supreme respect regardless of their conduct? If so, does that imply that as long as not being illegal, they can literally do whatever they want without being questioned or spoken up against by lay people and with the silent acquiescence of other monastics? Oh, I mean, there's literally millions of Buddhist monks in the world. And whenever you have millions of anyone in the world, there's always a few of them that are less impressive than others and a few of them that are really bad. And it's the same in the Buddhist world. There are a few Buddhist monks in the world who are very problematic. And it's also true that in Buddhist cultures, people tend to have a lot of respect for monks, which means that sometimes you have misbehaving monks who get away with a lot. That does happen sometimes, which is unfortunate. But even in Buddhist countries, if people start to figure out that a monk is really corrupt and really not behaving properly, then they will lose respect and they will stop supporting, generally speaking. Again, I know of many examples, which I won't go into because the details are irrelevant. But generally speaking, once people start to figure out that a monk is not really behaving properly, then yeah, that monks tends to start to lose support quickly. Which sometimes leads to them changing their ways and improving, or sometimes not. That's just the way it goes. Okay, and Mita says, as a lay practitioner who wants to start studying sutras, which is the first simple sutra to study? Well, rather than a single sutra to study, I recommend reading the anthology called In the Buddha's Words by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. It's relatively short, it's only a few hundred pages, and it has many short, simple sutras arranged in a logical manner to give somebody a complete overview of Buddhism through the Buddha's own words. So it's all either short suttas or excerpts from short suttas. So that's a really good place to start. Again, it's called In the Buddha's Words by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. And Joe says, would a monastic unconditionally pay more respect to another monastic regardless of their conduct more than they would to a layperson simply because of the bond they share within the sangha or simply because of the many years of training in Buddhist tradition? Well, again, it's not really useful to make blanket generalizations about Buddhist monks because we're all people. We're all individuals. So for some monks, yeah, that's definitely the case. Some monks will have an automatic higher level of respect for other monks than they will for lay people. And there's good reasons for that. It's not just tribalism. There's actually very good reasons for that. And there are other monks who, what they're looking at is more the strength of someone's practice. But that also goes hand in hand because generally speaking, as a general overall generalization, just because of the fact that people who are really, really committed to spiritual practice have a high tendency to become monastics, and people who are not severely committed to spiritual practice are more likely to remain as lay people, then generally speaking, as an overall average, the level of dedication tends to be higher in the monastic communities. Of course, you get some monks who are really awful, and you get some lay people who are really incredible, of course. But as an average overall, yes, in monastic circles, amongst monastics, there tends to be a higher level of dedication to the Buddhist path. So that automatically calls for some level of respect. And the other thing is just living this life. So I don't know how it looks from the outside, but this life is not, it's not easy if one does not have a really well-developed practice. It is not easy to be a monk. It's quite challenging. If your practice is strong, then it's delightful. It's amazing. There's nothing better. But if your practice is not strong, then this life is really difficult. So somebody who perseveres through that difficulty year after year after year, even if they're not very wise and not very pure and not very peaceful, even so, the fact that they've been persevering and trying to live a monastic life is inherently respectable. Even if you think, oh, they're not really a very good monk, it's like, yeah, but they've been trying for years. So you have to respect the fact that they're still at it after all these years. So yeah, I would say generally speaking, as a broad generalization, monks will tend to have a higher degree of respect for other monks than they will for lay people. That is generally true. And also as a general broad sweeping statement, strong practitioners will tend to have a higher level of respect for other strong practitioners instead of for not so committed practitioners. So these two things do not overlap perfectly, but there is some degree of overlap between them. And that's the last question. So I think we'll go ahead and conclude it this time. So we'll end the session with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, Sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.